In this video, we're going to pick up the technical conversation on WebDirect as part of the FileMaker 14 platform. Now, as a reminder, this is part 2 of a 2-part video, so if you've missed the part 1 video, feel free to go and watch that anytime. WebDirect is fundamentally not as powerful as FileMaker Pro because it runs in a browser. WebDirect does not run in a dedicated piece of software. FileMaker Server has its own database engine under the hood. FileMaker Pro has its own database engine under the hood. And as FileMaker Pro interacts back and forth across the network with FileMaker Server, data is exchanged back and forth and cached back and forth. And this interaction has been refined for more than 20 years, optimizing the performance of FileMaker Pro and the FileMaker platform. These two engines work together to process the data, to display it on the FileMaker Pro side for the user, to give the user the richest, snappiest, quickest experience possible. And it works really well. Now with WebDirect, there's no database engine on the web browser. So the only database engine that exists with WebDirect is only on the FileMaker Server side. So FileMaker Server has to send the data back and forth to the browser so WebDirect can display the information. And the browser can cache that information as efficiently as possible, but there's no second database engine there to help with calculations or any logical decision making to help display the information as smoothly and as seamlessly as possible to the end user. All the decision making and calculations have to be done on the FileMaker Server side. So understand the historic differences between the FileMaker model with FileMaker Pro and Server and the updated model between FileMaker Server and FileMaker WebDirect. For this reason, FileMaker Pro will always make customers happier with its snappier performance and fully rich feature sets when compared head-to-head with WebDirect. Now that we've talked about positioning with WebDirect, let's talk about optimizing solutions for deployment with WebDirect. Now keep in mind, simpler solutions may work fine without modification. This is just something you're going to have to test with to determine how much effort you're going to need to spend to get your WebDirect solution tuned up and working well. An existing FileMaker solution may break due to fundamental limitations of a web browser, as opposed to a robust client like FileMaker Pro. And a good example of that is the next item. A web browser operates in a single document interface, and so does WebDirect. That means no multiple windows. So if you're a FileMaker developer and you build a solution where you have a window open like this, and maybe you allow the user to pop open another window like this, and maybe a third window, and the user can interact between all the different windows because that's fundamentally part of the FileMaker platform. Well, WebDirect doesn't support that. The entire interaction and operation for WebDirect occurs in a single window. It's a single document interface. So keep in mind, you're going to have to restructure your FileMaker solution to operate in a single window if you're one of these people. Also keep in mind, it may take some additional work on your part to restructure your database if you're heavily invested in operating in a multi-window environment. Please keep in mind that this is a limitation of the browser world and not something arbitrarily imposed by FileMaker. Now keep in mind, there are some solutions that are going to need to be optimized at the layout level before they can run quickly in WebDirect. And that's what we're going to spend our time working on during the rest of this presentation, because it's really important and it'll really give us a major boost in performance if we focus on this. So we had a realization while testing WebDirect. Back in 2010, we were doing a lot of early testing with FileMaker Go, and we had a similar sort of thought back then, and that is that FileMaker Go greatly benefits from purpose-built layouts. And those are layouts that are specifically tuned for use on the iPad or iPhone. WebDirect benefits the same way from layouts that are specifically developed and tuned for it. Now, if you pay attention to what I'm saying here, then the rest of this presentation and techniques that we're going to show you will greatly improve the performance over a wide area network for your FileMaker Go and FileMaker Pro clients as well. This is a win-win-win all the way around. So we need to take a look at what users will be doing with WebDirect and what their workflow looks like. Now, at the FileMaker Developer Conference in 2013, there were a number of sessions that dealt with user-centered design. These sessions were recorded as videos, and they're now available to be downloaded from FileMaker's community website. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time discussing user-centered design, but if you're a good developer, most likely you're already leveraging user-centered design. And this is basically the concept of making sure that the user is in the center of your design choices as you're developing a database solution. The functions and capabilities on the layout are central to the user's workflow, and that's super critical here. In years past, you might consider these items fluffy, and not necessary, and not necessarily important, but by taking advantage of user-centered design, we can really optimize the workflow and really improve the performance of a WebDirect solution. Step 2. Layout should be created specifically and optimized for WebDirect. So that's where we're going with this. And how do we do that? Well, the tricks that we are going to dive into here, I've been talking about quite a bit for the last 18 months, and they've been talked about quite a bit at the last FileMaker Developer Conference. But if you've missed those videos, then now is a good time to sit down and learn this material. This material is applicable to both FileMaker 13 and FileMaker 14, but wasn't really possible with FileMaker 12. So the first and most important item to highlight is the idea of minimizing the number of objects on a layout. Now, I know this is not a new tip, but it might be new for you to think about, and I'm going to hit you up with the simple stuff first. What's an object? Well, an object is anything on the layout. So the top of the screen, we see a field and a label. Each of these two objects has their own block of XML, and within the XML is some CSS. Now, this is all hidden under the hood in FileMaker, and it's important to understand what's going on. That block of XML describes the object and how it's drawn on the layout in FileMaker. That's how FileMaker knows how to draw it, period. And so for FileMaker to draw it, that block of XML is pushed down through the pipe from FileMaker Server down to the client. Normally, it would be pushed down through the network to FileMaker Pro or Go, but in this case, it's going to the web browser, and then it comes back to the server if there's an update or a change to the data. But the idea is that every time we have an object, another new block, like the information at the top, has to be pushed down. So if you have a layout with a ton of objects on it, each object has a block of information just like the one you saw. And that results in pushing a ton of information down the network. So once again, think about workflow, think about optimizing the screens, and think about giving the users just what they need to see and not giving them everything, including the kitchen sink. So think about a more simple layout. Now, this layout might be too simple, but think about simplifying your layouts. This layout here has a whole lot less descriptive blocks of XML than the first one, which leads us to our first hot tip. Take a busy layout, break the objects into functional workflow, and we already talked about workflow. First, we're going to identify the pieces that we need, then break them across multiple layouts if possible. Some WebDirect users may not need all those layouts, so why make them load all the objects on the screen at one time? So this is a complete screenshot of FM Starting Point, the contact screen. So let's say, for the sake of argument, that we determine that this is a very important piece of workflow and they need everything on here. Now, this is a lot of information to push down. So maybe For the users who are on WebDirect, we're going to break this down into functional segments because they don't need all the information on the screen at one time. And if they're on an Android device anyway, it's not going to fit. So we have to break it down anyway. And maybe we determine that they only need the first block initially. So we give them this piece to edit and update. Now this might be one way to go, and maybe it's not the right way for your situation, but it's one possible way. And then from there, they could go on to the next screen. And you could build a set of buttons for navigation or a menu-driven system to take them to the various screens. But some of the users won't need to go to all the sections. And so the point is, why have them load the entire giant screen at one time to see all the pieces of the screen when they only needed to see and use one or two of the smaller sections of the layout? And those smaller sections load very rapidly. WebDirect is very sensitive to pushing lots of objects down through the network through to the web browser. So the goal is to really lighten the load. So keep that in mind. So step one was to review the workflow and to determine what the users really need. Step two, limit the objects and think about how you're going to limit those things and remove the items you don't need. And then break them down into different layouts. Step three is to get into customized themes and shared styles for your layouts. And this is the next great step that was only made possible with the release of FileMaker Pro 13. Now it's been improved in 14, but this all began in 13. Well, let's go ahead and dive into this. We're going to go ahead and switch out of our PowerPoint here and jump into FileMaker. So I have a copy of FM Starting Point, and I want to look at optimizing this for deployment on WebDirect. Now I have an application called Wireshark, and this is an application that allows me to measure the bandwidth, the amount of network traffic between FileMaker Server and a FileMaker client like FileMaker Go or Pro, or in this case WebDirect. Now I have a copy of FM Starting Point that I have put up on my FileMaker 14 server. And I've gone ahead and logged on to FM Starting Point with my copy of Pro 14. We're going to use Wireshark and measure the bandwidth from the main menu right here to the contacts data entry screen right here. I'm going to press the button right here that allows me to jump to contacts and create a new record. So first off, I'm on a layout here, and this is a layout that we created in FileMaker 12. So like most users, if you really want to customize your layouts in FileMaker 12, you end up using the classic theme and customizing the layout to meet your particular needs. And this was pretty common. At the FileMaker Developers Conference, when asked for a show of hands, a vast majority of users were using the classic themes to customize their layouts, just the way they wanted to use it. Just because in FileMaker 12, you couldn't really customize the themes and the styles the way you needed to. Remember, that was only added with 13. The problem with using the classic theme is that for every object on the layout, there's a complete set of CSS that tells FileMaker how to draw the object. And that is really wasteful. The idea is to have the objects that are very similar share the same description. And that is what we can now do by using a shared style. What I'm going to do is walk you through how we made this layout twice as fast. So first off, I'm going to create a new window, and I'm still on this contacts layout. I don't want to mess this up, so I'm going to go ahead and say layout, duplicate layout. Now from versions to versions of FileMaker products, from 12 to 13 to 14, FileMaker does update the themes. And some of the themes become out of date, and FileMaker introduced new themes. I can do that by going to the layout and change theme. Now the themes under Aspire were actually introduced in FileMaker 13. I'm going to select Vibrant because it's kind of cool. It reminds me of the layout that we used previously. I'm going to look at this, and it's not too horrible, but it's different than what we had before. And so I asked one of my engineers, that is one of the new guys on the team, to sit down, and he spent about half a day retooling this layout to make it look like the original design, because I kind of like the original layout over here. And I said, can't you make this and tweak it and customize it and make it look like this old design? And so we went to layout mode, and he actually went over here and went under data and into the appearance panel and made all sorts of little tweaks and things. And what he would do is he would take all the objects like this, go to Style, and after adjusting it the way he wanted it, he would say that this is going to be a new style. And he would say this is going to be FM starting points, standard edit box, and say, OK. Now this is going to be a saved style, and that's part of this theme, which is now part of this layout. Now this has its own block of CSS. I can click on other similar objects over here, and they still have their own block of CSS. And that CSS is part of that XML we saw earlier, right? The big block of code that explains how it renders in the layout mode, right? So I'm going to select all these over here and all these everywhere over here, and I'm going to tell them to use the standard saved style so that we have a shared style. That's a big, important vocabulary word, shared style. They're all sharing the same style instead of having their own individual block of descriptive CSS. They're all sharing the same block, and suddenly this layout is already much lighter. Now it was already radically transformed under the hood when I converted it to the Vibrant theme, but we wanted to customize it with shared styles so it had the design that my team had approved of. So what we end up with after half a day of work was a layout that looked like this. So here you can see what we have is a layout that looks almost identical. The difference is this layout right here is using the original classic theme. But this layout right here, we have created all of the shared styles between the fields, and it has its own custom theme. So this layout right here is much lighter, and that is the critical piece of knowledge that I'm trying to explain. And I hope that you understand that you can take this knowledge away and employ it on your own solution. So if you look right here at these labels, you can see that these labels share their own shared style. If you look at these buttons across the top, they share a shared style. So you get the idea that you have shared styles between similar objects. So what was the difference in bandwidth between this layout and the classic layout with a custom theme? Well, this layout to push to download one time as we navigate from home to contacts was 850 kilobytes of information, or almost a megabyte of information. And that's quite a bit for a single layout. By creating a custom theme for the layout and shared styles, the single process of going from the home layout to the contacts layout was reduced to about 425 kilobytes, or about half the original size, which may translate to about twice the speed of the original depending upon network conditions. But you may get twice the speed. So we thought that was a pretty amazing improvement. So as a side note, we decided that since we took a FileMaker design and we were monkeying around with it quite a bit, what if we took the FileMaker design and left it unaltered? And so we measured that too. We actually went to this layout over here, and this one is based upon the stone theme, and it is unaltered. Of course, from theme to theme, the weight will change somewhat, but the cost of going home to the contacts data entry layout went down to about 225 kilobytes. So we go from 850 to about 425, which is a huge improvement, and the interface looks almost identical. And if you're willing to give up on your custom design entirely, you can cut that design down in half again. Now at this point, I want to do a quick comparison on this layout when rendered between WebDirect 13 and WebDirect 14. Now you already saw the difference in actual user experience with the performance as you clicked. It was radically faster. But what is the actual difference in kilobytes? Well, it's not as much as you might think. When we did a test with WebDirect 14, of course, we were getting 425 kilobytes when going from the home screen to the contacts data entry screen. When going from the home screen to the contacts data entry screen on WebDirect 13, the amount of data that moved was somewhere around 480K. So it's a little bit more. So in the process of FileMaker optimizing the code they actually remove the amount of data that's going down the pipe, but not radically so. It's lighter by maybe 15%, somewhere in that range. So while the amount of data going from the server to WebDirect is lighter by about 15%, the efficiency of that code is radically improved, to the tune of making it run about twice as fast on the actual browser itself. So just keep that in mind. So now I've showed you how much you can save if you set up your own customized theme and shared styles. Let me explain to you a bit more about how this works. First off, if you click on an object and make customized changes to that individual object, then you're creating an additional level of CSS that is local to that object. This is called a local override for the CSS. Now this is a little bit technical, but effectively what you're doing is creating a whole lot of extra work, and the downside is that FileMaker has to push that extra CSS, that local override, down through the network from FileMaker Server to the web browser for the user to access it with WebDirect. Or for that matter, any remote client, including FileMaker Go or FileMaker Pro. So try to minimize making individual customizations to objects. If you're going to make individual customizations, try to take that object, go to Style, and save the style or create a new style. This allows those object attributes to be saved at the layout level and to be shared with other objects on the layout without additional penalty. Another hot tip that you should consider is that the Format Painter tool up here in the corner should be avoided at all costs if you're building a layout for deployment on WebDirect. And that's because of the way the Format Painter tool works. Now, FileMaker Engineering is aware of this issue that I'm about to explain to you. And they haven't come up with an easy way of fixing it yet, so we're just kind of stuck with it. And that is that when you use the Format Painter tool, it copies the settings of one object and allows you to apply them to another object. And of course, you would think to yourself that if you have an object that is saved to a style, then it will replicate those settings to the object that you're painting the settings to. Because the Object Painter tool is a tool that allows you to basically copy settings off of one object and apply them to another object. The problem with the Format Painter tool is that when it paints those settings to the destination object, it paints them in entirely as local overrides. Now just a second ago, if you're paying attention, you remember that I said local overrides are bad. Well, that's right. Local overrides create all sorts of extra bulky CSS. So when you use the Format Painter tool, all the settings for the object that you just painted into become really fat and heavy. Now you don't see it, but under the hood, that object is now way overweight. And it's unfortunate, but it's true. And as that object renders across the layout, it's going to cause a performance hit. Now if you have only one object on screen like that, you may never notice it. But if you run around on screen with the Format Painter tool, going clickety clickety click, you're going to be in big trouble because that's going to really put a drag on your layout rendering. So I advise against using the Format Painter tool for use with WebDirect. Now a couple of long-standing recommendations that I want to remind you of before we sign off. First off, sticking large images on your WebDirect layout is generally not recommended. So if you have a beautiful picture of Hawaii or a race car or maybe a fighter plane or something that you would like to use as a background image for WebDirect, I highly recommend against it. In fact, you need to stay away from images if at all possible. Now FileMaker 14 does have built-in images they call glyphs that are available as part of the button setup when you're setting up buttons in FileMaker Pro. These glyphs are very efficient and they're effectively what we call SVG. That's vector artwork, but it's very efficient, optimized artwork that's really lightweight. So those are good images that you can use, but they're somewhat drab and boring. So I imagine that other people are going to come out with libraries of SVGs that you'll be able to copy and paste into your FileMaker solution. As a general rule, creating fancy images with Photoshop is going to create large images that FileMaker has to render and push down through the network. Once again, that's not recommended. A couple other tips about WebDirect. Tab and slide controls generally have a lot of object data associated with them. That's that XML that we saw earlier. I recommend using tab and slide controls sparingly, just for the sake of not loading extra data on your screen that you don't need. Once again, create dedicated workflow that's mission specific to the users who are accessing the WebDirect interface. If you create tabbed interfaces and you load tons of data into the tabbed interface, WebDirect has to download all that information to display it. And if you have an underpowered Android device, that's going to make your life more challenging than it has to be. The same is also true for popovers. Popovers were added in FileMaker 13 and give you some ways of kind of mitigating the issues of not having multiple windows that you can pop in a browser. But of course, don't get too crazy with adding too many popovers. Because of course, FileMaker WebDirect has to collect all that popover data through the network to render the popover should you click on it. So just keep that in mind. Now, something else to keep in mind is that script triggers are something that's new to the FileMaker platform probably in the last decade or so. Script triggers are really neat, but because there's no database engine in your WebDirect, anytime you trip a script trigger, WebDirect has to send a message to FileMaker Server across the network and ask FileMaker Server what to do. So if you're the kind of person that likes to put script triggers everywhere, you might want to rethink that just a little bit, because every time you activate a script trigger, you're causing interaction back and forth across the network between you and your FileMaker server. And for best performance, you want to mitigate that traffic back and forth. Now, something cool came up during our testing, and this is one area where WebDirect is really awesome, and that is doing sorts on large sets of data in your database. Now, as opposed to FileMaker Pro, when accessing remote data, WebDirect is actually faster for sorting data than FileMaker Pro is. And why is this? Well, if you're doing a sort in WebDirect, the sort is actually performed on FileMaker Server, where the data is actually local on the hard drive of the FileMaker server, making the performance much faster than it would be on FileMaker Pro. Keep in mind that for FileMaker Pro to do the sort, FileMaker Server actually sends all the data down through the network to FileMaker Pro, so FileMaker Pro can do the sort. Now, this is a funky issue, one that I've actually been fighting with FileMaker engineering about for a number of years, because I think it's a feature that needs to be added to Server to allow Server to actually do some of the sorts for FileMaker Pro. And if you're sorting 250,000 records, all 250,000 records have to be downloaded to the network, as opposed to WebDirect, which if you tell it to sort 250,000 records, it simply sends a sort command back to FileMaker Server, and the 250,000 records are already on Server. The server sorts them lickety-split at warp speed, and it's done way before FileMaker Pro could ever have it done. It's a really interesting side effect of the whole WebDirect design. It gets into this whole issue of client-server design technologies and where FileMaker's at with everything. So we decided to actually put pen to paper on this and get a stopwatch out and run some tests. So we had a database with 350,000 records in it, and we decided to have WebDirect do a sort for us, and the sort took 57 seconds with WebDirect. And so that's with FileMaker Server doing the sort for us on the server, and WebDirect displaying the information. So when WebDirect actually does a sort, of course, we don't see it actually running on server. WebDirect just gives us a little spinny dialog that says it's processing, and then 57 seconds later we get it done. Now, that's opposed to 225 seconds for FileMaker Pro, which is much, much, much longer. Like way, way longer. That's in the neighborhood of 400% slower than WebDirect. So that's one area where WebDirect is much faster than FileMaker Pro. So now we've come to the Q&A portion of our presentation. We've actually received a handful of questions from users about WebDirect, so we want to answer those real quick. The first question we did receive was, can you access WebDirect with Chromebook? Well, FileMaker is not officially endorsing Chromebook as an accepted web client. I can tell you that I have personally been testing the Chromebook, at least the Chromebook from Toshiba with the latest updates run on it. This is Toshiba's Chromebook 2 with 4 gigs of memory. I actually went out and made sure I got the one with a little bit more memory, It's a little bit more expensive, but more RAM is always better. And made sure I had the latest Chrome browser on it. And as a result, it's worked pretty flawlessly with WebDirect. Now, just to be clear about the requirements, I should cover those at this point. The requirements are for browsers, desktop browsers, it's Safari 8X, Internet Explorer 10 or 11, and Chrome 38 or later. And of course, on my Chromebook, it does have Chrome build 38 something or another. So theoretically, it's supported. Now, FileMaker says it's not officially supported, but it does seem to work pretty well. Firefox does seem to work pretty well, but once again, that's not on the supported list. So Chrome is kind of ubiquitous everywhere. It kind of took over the world from Firefox in a lot of ways. Google is quite the monster when it comes to being ubiquitous everywhere, and has really displaced almost all the other browsers. So I think you're in good shape with that. On mobile browsers, you need to be using mobile Safari 8X on iOS 8.1 or better. So if you're using older versions of iOS, you're out of luck. Chrome 3.8 or later on Android 4.4 or better. And I think that's the KitKat Android, if you're familiar with all the code names for the Androids. I believe that's KitKat. If I'm wrong, someone will correct me on that. Next question. This is very similar. Can you use WebDirect to allow access for older computers to FileMaker 14? So we're into this issue of, can you use a Windows 98 machine or Windows 2000 machine or something like that to get access to FileMaker 14? I guess the question would be is, can you run Chrome 38 or later on those machines? I don't know how far Chrome 38 will run on an old Windows machine. I guess if you can run Chrome 38 on one of those older machines, it might work. Your mileage may vary. I haven't tried that. Just keep in mind that FileMaker did not create WebDirect as a crutch for people who won't buy new computers to get into new technology. It's one of those sort of things in life. If you won't buy updated computers, you're probably not going to be able to use updated software. And of course, the converse is also true, if you haven't figured that out yet. If you buy new computers, you're not going to be able to use really old versions of software. How many of you are on new Macs trying to use FileMaker 5? Raise your hands. You know that story already. It doesn't work. Can you use FileMaker 11 with WebDirect? No. FileMaker WebDirect, it is published by FileMaker Server 13 or FileMaker Server 14. I highly, highly recommend Server 14 because the 14 product is vastly improved over 13. I think we demonstrated that sufficiently at the beginning of the presentation. What devices can access WebDirect? Any mobile browsers that are using mobile Safari 8X on iOS 8.1, that's your iPhones and iPads on 8.1. So if you run all the latest updates on them, you're good. Now, FileMaker recommends the latest hardware, but like I said, you can try older hardware and your mileage may vary. Once again, I don't work for FileMaker, so I can say, go ahead and try it, but if it doesn't work, don't get mad, right? And then, of course, on Droid, Chrome 38, and on Android 4.4 or newer. Next question, I've been working on a FileMaker 12 file or 13 file. Can I just load it straight up on WebDirect? And the answer, of course, is technically yes. You can load it straight up on FileMaker Server 14. You're going to need to make sure that you have a security privilege set up to allow access to the WebDirect extended privilege. We didn't really cover that in here, but just keep that in mind. You'll also need to make sure the file is up and posted and that the WebDirect publishing is turned on for FileMaker Server 14. So the answer is technically yes. So that basically wraps things up here for our FileMaker 14 WebDirect video. I appreciate everyone who's watched this video, and be sure to pass this link on to your friends. Subscribe to our channel here at FileMaker Training Videos. We have lots of viewers. And if you want to learn more about FileMaker Pro and you want some awesome training with more animations, and I promise actually more explosions and much more higher degrees of entertainment, check out learningfilemaker.com. I really regret not having more explosions in this video, more entertainment. It just didn't lend itself to any mayhem and disasters. And so I do apologize for that. But in the Pro 14 training course, we definitely have more interesting animations and lots of explosions to keep people entertained. So that's it for now. Feel free to email me anytime with questions at support@rcconsulting. Don't forget to like this video and post your comments down below.